States learn from costs, not from outcomes. Yet, in our most critical alliances, the machinery that transmits those costs has been systematically switched off.
This is not merely a failure of policy, it is a failure of feedback. Today, we explore the protection trap.
Welcome to Journal Briefings. I am host 1 and I am joined by host 2. In this debut episode, we dissect the opening essay of Journal, examining why shielded states grow more capable while simultaneously losing the ability to correct themselves.
It is a vital premise. And if you are joining us for this deep dive, you should understand from the outset that we're embarking on a highly precise structural examination.
Indeed. We are anchoring our analysis today in an essay titled The Protection Trap. It was published in Journal, which is dedicated to rigorous analysis across ideas, law, strategy, and international affairs.
Right. And our objective today is to dissect a specific, highly structural paradox in modern international relations.
A paradox where overwhelming military success actively conceals profound strategic failure.
Exactly. And the author posits that this concealment happens for a deeply mechanical reason. The consequences of a state's use of force are structurally interrupted. They're intercepted before they can ever reach the very policymakers who ordered that force.
It is a fascinating thesis, but we need to establish the boundaries of our inquiry right away.
We do. We are not engaging in partisan punditry today, nor are we here to litigate the daily fluctuations of geopolitical news.
Precisely. Our objective is to conduct a cold, structural critique of state behavior.
The underlying premise of the essay we are examining is that a state functions much like a biological organism. It relies on a sensory apparatus to survive.
When a state acts, the geopolitical environment pushes back.
Right. That friction, the cost incurred, that is the essential data the state requires to learn, to adapt, and, to correct a failing strategy.
So our focus today is on a structural anomaly. What happens when a great power patron steps in and selectively severs its client state's nervous system?
Yes. The client state continues to act. It continues to exert force. But it ceases to feel the precise type of systemic pain required to induce a change in its strategic calculus.
We are looking at a pathology that traditional political science has really struggled to accurately name.
It has. And to understand the pathology, we have to look at how we typically diagnose these relationships.
Which requires a fundamental conceptual shift from us. We need to look at classical alliance theory.
If you read the foundational literature of the 20th century, the traditional model of a patron-client alliance is utterly obsessed with one metric.
Dependence.
Precisely. Dependence. The classical architecture imagines a small, inherently fragile client state. It is huddled under the protective, overarching umbrella of a massive great power patron.
In that traditional model, the client is severely constrained, structurally speaking.
It is. It simply lacks the material capacity to move without explicit permission from its sponsor.
And its geopolitical ambitions are strictly capped by whatever the patron is willing to underwrite.
That is the bedrock of classical alliance architecture. And from that assumption of inherent structural weakness emerges what we call the traditional security dilemma in alliances.
Right, the classic tension. It is historically framed as a constant oscillating tension between two fears, entrapment and abandonment.
Let us break down the mechanics of that tension. The weak client state lives in a condition of perpetual dread regarding abandonment.
Because it lacks independent capacity.
Exactly. Its ultimate existential fear is being left exposed to a hostile regional environment without the patron's shield.
And the great power patron, conversely, dreads entrapment.
Yes. Its ultimate fear is being dragged into a peripheral, bloody conflict that it did not choose. A conflict triggered by a reckless but materially dependent ally.
So this dynamic, the push and pull of entrapment versus abandonment, it operates on a single fundamental assumption.
Which is that the client's boldness is ultimately physically bounded by the sponsor's consent.
If the sponsor cuts the cord, the client cannot function.
Exactly. But the essay concedes that while this classical model still holds true for many states today, it is missing something crucial.
A profound structural shift that has occurred in specific critical alliances.
Yes. This old model of inherent dependence completely fails to describe what the author introduces as the capable client.
This is where the framework fundamentally shifts. Because a capable client is a profoundly different entity from the weak dependence of the 20th century.
We are examining a state that has, over decades, developed its own highly sophisticated indigenous industrial base.
It has built its own independent, top-tier intelligence apparatus.
Right. A capable client does not sit waiting for a green light from Washington or London or Beijing. It possesses the material ability to act readily.
It initiates operations, and crucially, this is where the classical model breaks down. It frequently pulls the great power patron behind it.
Exactly, rather than the patron directing the client. For this specific class of capable state, the old binary fears of entrapment and abandonment, well, they no longer dictate its immediate behavior.
The material reality has changed, which means the binding constraints have changed.
For the capable client, the central question of statecraft is no longer whether it has the physical, logistical, or military capacity to execute an action.
Because it already has the munitions manufacturing, it has the cyber capabilities, it has the operational reach to strike deep into adversary territory.
Precisely. The binding question is no longer about capacity. It is about consequence.
And the essay argues that the supreme hazard we are witnessing in the modern era is not client dependence. It is what the author calls distorted cost transmission.
Consider the difference. If a traditional weak dependent state makes a catastrophic strategic error and its patron abruptly withdraws support, that client state collapses.
The collapse is brutal.
It is brutal, but from a systems perspective, it is a functional correction. It is a harsh, immediate feedback loop.
But the capable client operates differently.
Because its internal capacity sustains it, but its penalties fail to reach its central decision-making node. So it does not collapse when it errs.
Instead, it possesses the endurance to accumulate strategic error over a span of years or even decades.
The machinery of impact has been switched off, but the engine of action remained fully operational.
That distinction brings us to what the author views as a massive analytical failure in modern diplomacy.
It is a severe misdiagnosis. If policymakers are looking at a capable client, but diagnosing it using the outdated framework of traditional dependence, they are going to prescribe a fundamentally lethal cure.
If you view a capable client through the lens of classical theory, you might observe its friction with its patron and conclude that the client is suffering from too much constraint.
Right, and the logical traditional prescription for a state that seems chafed by its alliance would be to grant it more autonomy.
To loosen the reins, to let it operate more freely.
But the author argues forcefully that autonomy is the absolute worst possible prescription in this specific structural condition.
Because when a state already suffers from distorted cost transmission, giving it more autonomy merely severs whatever fragile residual feedback mechanisms might still remain.
Yes, it is an attempt to cure a perceived disease of constraint by fatally deepening the actual disease of blindness.
The core hazard, the author stresses, is not that capable clients possess the material capacity to move without permission.
The supreme danger to global stability is that they move without paying.
In a functioning, rational system of statecraft, autonomy must be inextricably balanced by consequence.
If a state acts independently, it must absorb the independent cost of that action. That absorption of cost is what disciplines its future choices.
By systematically granting autonomy to a state that is structurally shielded from the terminal consequences of its actions, you are engineering a very dangerous entity.
An entity that possesses the kinetic power of a sovereign actor, but lacks the structural necessity to learn from its geopolitical environment.
It is power divorced from consequence.
It is.
If you're trying to visualize this structural shift, I find it helpful to think about it in mechanical terms.
The architectural analogies in the text are quite precise.
Classical alliance theory essentially treats the weak client state like a tethered vessel. Picture a small, unpowered boat tied by a heavy rope to a massive great power dreadnought.
A vessel that literally cannot sail into dangerous waters unless the patron ship pulls the rope and drags it there.
Exactly. In that scenario, the primary danger to the small boat is immobility, or perhaps being dragged into a storm against its will.
But the author's new framework, the capable client, reveals a completely different piece of machinery.
Imagine a ship that has been upgraded with a massive, highly advanced, completely independent propulsion system.
It can sail wherever it wants at incredibly high speeds.
But the patron, in a misguided effort to protect the crew of this new ship from the stress and anxiety of navigating the open sea, has systematically disabled the ship's compass, its radar, and its depth warning sensors.
It is a chilling image. The danger in this new scenario is no longer immobility.
Right. The ship has plenty of kinetic energy. The danger is high-speed drift in waters filled with hidden reefs.
The ship is moving powerfully, but the sensory apparatus required to realize it is heading into a reef has been deactivated.
The analogy holds up under rigorous scrutiny, I think.
It does. The independent propulsion system perfectly represents the capable client's indigenous industrial and military base. It can move.
And the disabled sensors represent the deactivated feedback loops.
But to understand exactly how those sensors are disabled, how the machinery is actually switched off, we must transition from the conceptual architecture to the specific granular mechanics of the framework.
We need to examine how costs are actually transmitted through the bureaucratic and political architecture of a state.
And the author's methodology here requires us to make a fundamental break with how we normally discuss geopolitical consequences in public discourse.
We have to start by entirely discarding the habit of treating a state's penalty or cost as a single homogeneous lump sum.
That is a very common analytical error. In casual analysis, and frankly in much of the professional literature, there's a tendency to look at a state engaged in a conflict and simply tally up its losses on a single ledger.
We look at the military casualties, we look at the inflation rate, we look at the diplomatic censures, and we put them all in one big bucket.
We add them up and we ask one binary question. Is this number large?
If the number is large, we assume the state is paying a heavy price and will therefore adjust its behavior.
But the author argues that this is fundamentally not how a state processes pain. Cost does not enter a political system through one single door.
It is not a monolithic weight dropped on the roof of the Capitol.
Precisely the opposite. Cost moves through highly distinct structured channels. And each channel possesses a completely different level of efficiency and leverage when it comes to forcing a change in state behavior.
The essay meticulously maps out this architecture, which it terms the cost transmission network.
It divides this network into three highly specific channels. Let us examine the first, the internal channel.
This channel consists of the domestic mechanics of the state. We are talking about the electoral system, the stability of the domestic economy, the independence of the courts,
Public opinion, and the institutional coherence of the military establishment.
When a state's geopolitical action causes severe economic inflation, or when it requires the massive disruptive mobilization of a civilian reserve army, that specific cost travels along the internal wire.
It is domestic friction.
Then we have the second channel, the operational channel.
This is strictly defined as the adversary's actual physical power to impose a tactical price in the theater of conflict.
If a state engages in a military campaign and the adversary successfully destroys its armor, disrupts its logistical supply lines, or inflicts heavy casualties on the battlefield.
Or degrades its electronic warfare capabilities.
Yeah.
Those immediate kinetic consequences are traveling exclusively via the operational wire.
It is the friction of the battlefield itself.
And finally, we have the third channel, the international channel.
This wire carries the weight of the broader global system.
It encompasses global legitimacy, diplomatic isolation, and the enforcement of international legal sanctions.
It is the mechanism by which the international community at large imposes friction on a state's strategic choices.
Now, in a healthy, fully unshielded state, a state operating without a great power patron, the current in every single one of these three channels must eventually return to the same central node.
The internal domestic pain, the operational battlefield friction, and the international diplomatic isolation must all converge in the specific room where the executive leadership makes strategic decisions.
They combine to force a brutal calculation that ultimately results in a necessary change of behavior.
And this brings us to the most vital mechanical concept in the entire framework, the selective shunt.
The author posits that the great power patron does not, and functionally cannot, cover the entire cost transmission network.
The patron does not straddle all three wires.
Instead, the patron sits almost exclusively on the international channel, and it operates there as a highly engineered shunt.
For those familiar with electrical engineering, a shunt is a device that creates a low-resistance path for an electric current,
allowing that current to bypass a specific point in the circuit.
The patron does not magically reach into reality and cancel the penalty. Rather, it diverts the penalty before it can reach the central decision maker.
The mechanics of this diversion are highly observable in modern diplomacy. Let us look at how the shunt operates in practice.
When a global institution, such as the International Court of Justice or the UN General Assembly, issues a severe legal or diplomatic verdict against the capable client,
the great power patron utilizes its UN Security Council veto to absorb the material impact of that verdict.
The legal verdict still occurred in reality. The world witnessed it.
But the structural consequence of it, the enforcement mechanisms, those were shunted.
Similarly, when the client state is engaged in a prolonged high-intensity conflict and its munitions arsenal is rapidly depleting.
A situation that would normally serve as a hard physical operational limit, forcing the state to seek a cessation of hostilities.
The patron initiates a massive wartime resupply. The patron bridges the gap, lifting the constraint of physical depletion.
When global isolation threatens to manifest as crippling systemic economic sanctions, the patron provides an overarching diplomatic umbrella,
slowing or entirely stopping the conversion of political isolation into material deprivation.
The shunt holds the international wire open, and the terminal geopolitical pressure that should have returned to the decision-making center simply bleeds off into the ether.
I want to focus on what I consider the most critical sentence in the author's analysis. It is a distinction that completely upends how we consume geopolitical news.
The author states, everything turns on one distinction, and if it falls, the argument falls with it.
Incurring a cost and transmitting it are not the same event.
When you actually break down the mechanics of that statement, it is a profound realization.
We are so conditioned to believe that observing a penalty is the same as the state feeling it.
But this framework argues that a penalty can occur in objective, undeniable reality. It can be known to the entire domestic populace.
It can fill the front pages of every major newspaper on Earth.
And yet, structurally, bureaucratically, that penalty can still fail to ever actually reach the single node within the state apparatus that is capable of translating that pain into a change of strategic course.
Incurring the damage and transmitting the signal of that damage to the steering wheel are two entirely separate events.
It is the profound silence of the shunt that makes it so difficult to detect. Because the shunt diverts the systemic pressure rather than erasing the historical event, the visible, visceral losses do not stop.
The battlefield casualties still occur. The domestic economy still strains. The UN resolutions are still drafted and debated.
The external appearance of consequence remains entirely intact. To the untrained observer, or even the seasoned analyst looking at the aggregate ledger, it looks as though the capable client is under immense, perhaps unbearable pressure.
But because the current on the international wire is bypassed just before it hits the central decision-making node, the failure of the feedback loop announces itself nowhere.
As the author notes, the debate is not over whether penalties exist. Of course they exist. The vital analytical question is why some of those exact penalties never arrive at their final destination to force a course correction.
The outcome of this diversion is genuinely chilling when you map it out structurally.
The system takes vital strategic signals, the exact necessary data that should prompt a rational actor to realize a strategy is categorically failing and must be abandoned.
And it structurally converts those signals into mere noise.
The client state isn't learning from its environment. It is merely enduring it. And as a result, it accumulates massive strategic error, round after round for years.
Hold on, though. I am looking at the architecture of these three channels, and there is a friction point here that we need to interrogate.
Please, what is the friction point?
If we accept that the patron is only acting as a selective shunt on the international channel, then the internal and operational channels are still wide open, right?
They are. The state is still suffering sovereign credit downgrades. Its domestic tax base is straining.
Its soldiers are still experiencing lethal friction in the field.
Yes.
So if 2 out of the 3 channels are actively delivering pain, why wouldn't that be more than enough to force a rational leadership to change course?
It is a critical question.
Why is the shutting off of the international channel alone sufficient to paralyze the entire learning mechanism of the state?
That is the essential stress test of the theory. Why does neutralizing one wire effectively lobotomize the other two? The answer lies in understanding the ultimate calculus of political survival for a ruling establishment.
Survival being the operative metric for any leadership.
Exactly. The internal and operational costs, the economic inflation, the protests, the battlefield friction, they are undeniably painful.
But they are frequently categorized and politically managed by leadership as the necessary, manageable friction of warfare.
They are framed as the accepted tragic price of doing business in a hostile regional environment. A government can often survive a recession.
It can survive military setbacks by appealing to nationalism or wartime resilience.
However, the international channel represents something fundamentally different. The threat of total global isolation, the implementation of comprehensive, devastating sanctions that lock a state out of the global financial system.
The removal of overarching international legitimacy.
These represent an absolute existential threat to to the economic and political survival of a modern, interconnected, capable state.
So by applying the shunt strictly to the international wire, the great power patron effectively lowers the absolute threshold of pain just enough to allow the domestic political leadership to survive.
Precisely. If a leader knows, structurally, that the UN veto will always be deployed and that the domestic economy will never face a total global blockade, they can absorb the domestic protests.
They can absorb the operational setbacks without being forced from power.
The international shielding removes the terminal velocity of the consequences. It neutralizes the ultimate urgency of the other two channels.
The internal pain becomes a chronic, manageable condition rather than a fatal one.
And therefore, it ceases to be a catalyst for strategic correction. The leader can continuously point to the steadfast diplomatic and military support of the great power patron as definitive proof that the state's fundamental standing in the world is secure,
Thereby structurally disarming domestic critics who warn of impending ruin.
Exactly.
So if this selective shunt is as powerful and paralyzing as the author claims, what happens when it is actually stress-tested in the real world?
The essay does not leave this in the realm of abstraction. It points us to a perfect laboratory to observe these mechanics in action.
The text utilizes the case study of Israel following its 2026 war with Iran, a conflict fought alongside the United States.
And just to be absolutely clear on our boundaries today, for the integrity of this analysis, we are employing this case study purely as a cold, structural verification of a theoretical model.
Yes, that is a necessary constraint. We are not engaging in a political evaluation of the conflict itself. We are not assessing the merits of the respective actors' positions.
Nor are we litigating the moral dimensions of the war. Our objective is strictly to examine the mechanics of alliance feedback.
We're looking at how the state structures described in the text process, or fundamentally failed process, the geopolitical costs of their actions.
We are operating strictly as analysts, verifying a structural hypothesis.
A necessary and vital boundary for this kind of rigorous critique. With that framework established, let us examine the operational outcomes cited in the text regarding the 2026 war.
The essay notes that the capable client achieved what military historians and analysts would widely categorize as a massive operational and tactical victory.
The military strikes executed were deep, penetrating, and technologically sophisticated.
The adversary's command and control structure was effectively decapitated. The adversary's nuclear program was severely degraded, setting it back years.
From a purely kinetic military science perspective, it was a display of overwhelming, unmitigated capability.
Yet the strategic outcome was deeply incongruous with that massive tactical success.
The Iranian regime survived the war intact.
The conflict concluded not in a stable, negotiated settlement or the establishment of a new, enduring regional architecture,
but rather in an ambiguous, highly fragile understanding.
Which brings us directly to the central puzzle the author identifies in this specific laboratory. We are observing a state that possesses overwhelming military power.
A state capable of achieving almost any tactical objective it sets for itself.
Yet, it cannot convert that massive kinetic power into a stable, enduring political arrangement.
And more importantly, despite this repeated, observable failure to translate force into long-term stability, the state shows absolutely no sign of revising its overarching strategic posture.
Why does a rational actor continue to employ and heavily invest in a strategy that consistently fails to produce a stable settlement?
The author immediately anticipates the most common visceral objection to this puzzle.
The objection raised by critics of this theory is straightforward. How can anyone possibly claim that Israel's penalties do not reach its decision-makers?
Because the state clearly pays an incredibly heavy, highly visible price for its security posture.
The text details a specific, severe list of these costs incurred during the conflict. The mass mobilization of the civilian reserve, which fundamentally disrupts the labor force.
Severe structural economic strain.
A highly damaging sovereign credit downgrade.
The profound geopolitical and psychological trauma of a genocide case brought before the International Court of Justice.
And the terrifying physical reality of ballistic missiles falling on domestic cities.
The objection states that this state is clearly, undeniably suffering. Therefore, the feedback loop must be intact and the theory is wrong.
But this is where the sheer brilliance of the author's structural model comes into focus. The author states that this heavy list of penalties is not the solution to the puzzle, it is the puzzle itself.
Let's execute the structural verification the author demands of us. We must take that specific list of heavy costs and map them precisely onto the architecture of the cost transmission network we defined earlier.
Where do these specific costs travel?
The mass mobilization of citizens, the severe economic contraction, the sovereign credit downgrade. These consequences all travel firmly and exclusively along the internal channel.
The physical destruction of infrastructure, the battlefield casualties, the missiles reaching the domestic depth, these travel along the operational and internal channels.
And here is the absolute crux of the structural verification.
Washington, the great power patron, does not sit on either of those two channels.
Washington does not vote in Israeli domestic elections to punish incumbent leaders for severe economic strain.
Washington cannot physically intercept a rocket over Tel Aviv in a manner that retroactively nullifies the profound psychological and physical trauma of that threat to the populace.
Washington does not possess the capability to return a battlefield casualty to life.
Therefore, the recurring existence of these specific horrific penalties is exactly what the author's model predicts.
The existence of these penalties leaves the core argument entirely intact, because the argument was never about the absence of internal or operational pain.
Exactly. The patron only touches the international wire. The shunt is holding one wire, and one wire alone.
The United States veto at the UN Security Council, the intensive diplomatic maneuvering in global forums to prevent systemic isolation.
The provision of overarching strategic and legal cover. This is the specific shunt that structurally turns the verdict of the international community into a negligible, manageable price for the political leadership.
The penalties are incredibly real. The pain is real.
But because the terminal threat of comprehensive global isolation is structurally diverted, those penalties reach everywhere in the society except the specific room where the overarching national policy is set.
The model holds perfectly.
It does. The capable state absorbs heavy penalties, but the specific terminal feedback required to force a strategic reappraisal is converted into manageable background noise by the patron's shunt.
It is a profound, chilling demonstration of the theory in action. We see a state with massive operational success and heavy internal penalties suffering from deep strategic stagnation, precisely because the international feedback loop is shunted.
The machinery of impact, in the single domain that matters most for long-term strategic correction and regime survival, has been decisively switched off.
Which leads us to a deeply troubling epistemological question.
If this failure feedback is so structurally apparent when we break it down channel by channel, why does it resist detection by so many seasoned analysts, diplomats, and policymakers?
Why do the capitals of the world continually struggle to see the protection trap for what it is?
The author transitions here to a profound problem, rooted in how we actually observe and measure international relations. The essay introduces a concept from statistics that is vital to grasp if we are to understand this blind spot.
Identification under selection.
This is where the analysis becomes truly revelatory. The author argues that the single most crucial variable in assessing the actual health and reality of this alliance is the patron's actual, tested capacity to restrain its capable client when the two parties fundamentally disagree.
We need to know, does the patron actually have the leverage to force the client to change course against its will?
That is the definitive variable we must measure to understand if the client is truly constrained, or if it is merely drifting at high speed.
But here is the epistemological blind spot the author identifies. We cannot observe this variable.
We cannot measure the patron's restraining capacity because the entire alliance relationship is deliberately, meticulously engineered by both sides to prevent a genuine testing moment from ever arising.
The daily, intensive diplomatic management of the alliance is entirely devoted to avoiding a public structural rupture.
We have a major blind spot here because we are trying to measure a power that the system is actively designed to hide.
Let's unpack the corrupted inference that analysts frequently make because of this blind spot.
When analysts, journalists, and even historians look at an alliance, they often observe moments of profound policy convergence.
They see a joint military operation, they see a synchronized diplomatic escalation at the UN, they see a massive shared intelligence initiative.
And the common, almost universal analytical reflex is to point to that convergence and say, look at how closely aligned they are. Look at the coordination.
This is a healthy, functioning alliance where the patron clearly has immense influence and the client is highly responsive.
The author aggressively deconstructs this fallacy. A war that both partners desire tells us absolutely nothing about whether one partner could have stopped the other if they had wanted to.
It is an analytical void.
Policy convergence is not proof of restraint. It is merely proof of shared preferences in that specific historical moment.
The true, definitive test of a patron's restraining power is not coordination. It is severe, fundamental disagreement.
Can the patron impose its will when the capable client believes its core existential security interests dictate a different path?
Because the bureaucratic machinery of the alliance works tirelessly to ensure that level of stark disagreement never materializes publicly, the crucial variable remains entirely hidden from our view.
We are attempting to measure a property of the system that the system is structurally designed to conceal.
I think we need an analogy to really cement this concept of identification under selection, because it is the linchpin of why policymakers misread these situations.
It is a critical point to clarify.
Imagine you are an engineer tasked with evaluating the structural integrity of a massive hydroelectric dam. You need to know, definitively, if this dam can hold back a catastrophic 100-year flood.
But you're only allowed to observe the dam during a prolonged, multi-year drought.
You look at the concrete, it looks solid. The small amount of water resting behind it is perfectly placid.
The common corrupted inference would be to observe this calm state and declare that the dam is holding perfectly, therefore its structural integrity is absolute.
But the policy convergence we observe in these alliances is exactly like that drought. It presents zero stress to the system.
We can only truly know if the patron has true restraining power during a massive flood of profound strategic disagreement.
But here's the trick of the alliance architecture. The daily, intensive diplomatic management acts as a massive, highly efficient spillway.
Whenever pressure begins to build, whenever a disagreement threatens to test the patron's leverage, the diplomats open the spillway.
They release the tension through subtle compromises, deferred decisions, and ambiguous language, ensuring the flood never actually hits the dam.
Therefore, the patron's actual leverage, its raw ability to withstand and contain the capable client's independent ambition, is a ghost variable.
It is a capacity we all assume exists, but which is systematically shielded from empirical testing.
That analogy captures the epistemological trap perfectly. Because we only ever observe the system in a state of managed agreement or minor, carefully choreographed friction, we mistakenly infer that the patron possesses a structural, ultimate veto over the client's strategic choices.
But if the client is truly capable, possessing its own robust industry and intelligence, and if its internal cost transmission is successfully shunted by the patron, that presumed veto may not actually exist.
The patron may be far more captive to the client's momentum than anyone realizes, masked entirely by the ongoing illusion of constant coordination and managed spillways.
Which brings us to the final and undoubtedly most tragic dimension of the framework.
If the decisive variable, the patron's capacity to restrain, is completely hidden from direct observation, how do we, as analysts, actually track this phenomenon?
How do we know that the protection trap is actively occurring if we can't see the restraint being tested?
The author provides two key indicators, essentially asking us to track what approaches the hidden variable from the edges of the system.
The first indicator is observable directly in the behavior of the capable client state, specifically in the timeline and rhythm of its conflicts.
The text refers to this phenomenon as shortening intervals.
Because the shielded state is structurally immune to the ultimate terminal international costs of its actions, it expends military force, achieves high-level tactical success, but inevitably fails to produce a stable political settlement.
Because no settlement is reached, the original threat inevitably reconstitutes and returns to the same arena.
The text points to historical examples. The recurring operations in Lebanon, the multiple rounds of conflict in Gaza, and the posture toward Iran after the 2026 war.
In each of these cases, massive force is spent. It does not convert into a stable political end, and so it must be spent again.
The definitive signature of the protection trap is a state accumulating rounds of conflict rather than enduring settlements.
And crucially, the intervals between these rounds grow progressively shorter as the unresolved, compounding strategic friction accelerates.
The second indicator the author identifies lies not in the theater of conflict, but internally, within the domestic politics of the patron state itself.
The selective shunt, the diversion of international costs, is not a law of physics. It only functions as long as the patron's hand remains steady on the switch.
Therefore, to track the true health of the alliance and the stability of the trap, you do not look at the joint press conferences or the polished language of diplomatic summits.
You must meticulously monitor the patron's internal domestic coalition.
The essay points out that the political will required to maintain the shunt is not infinite. You must watch for the fraying of the patron's domestic consensus.
You look for a new political generation that did not inherit the historical ideological commitments of the Cold War era.
You look for an increasingly vocal left wing that rigorously questions the human rights implications of shielding the client.
You look for an isolationist right wing that increasingly asks why the patron continues to pay the immense geopolitical, diplomatic, and financial costs of providing this shunt.
As these domestic pressures within the patron state build, the hand holding the shunt inevitably begins to tremble.
Which leads directly to the tragic mechanism the author terms the rupture. This is the inevitable catastrophic climax of distorted cost transmission.
Consider how a healthy, unshielded state learns. Feedback arises continuously. It is gradual, adjusting the state's course a degree at a time.
The state makes a minor miscalculation. It feels the corresponding pain. It makes a minor correction. It is an evolutionary stabilizing process.
But for the shielded state, that continuous small-scale feedback has been systematically withheld for decades.
The geopolitical pressure generated by its actions did not magically disappear. It was merely diverted by the shunt. And that withheld pressure accumulates.
It builds up massively behind the dam.
When the patron's domestic politics finally force it to drop the shunt, when the circuit finally inevitably breaks, the correction does not arrive as a gentle evolutionary nudge.
It arrives as a catastrophic geopolitical rupture.
It manifests as a suddenly suspended shipment of critical munitions in the middle of a war, a shocking, unprecedented abstention at the UN Security Council that strips away legal cover overnight.
A wholesale, sudden reappraisal of a decades-long strategic alignment.
The tragedy here is entirely structural. Because the shielded state was systematically spared the small, manageable corrections over the years, the accumulated reality of its strategic environment hits it all at once.
The very protection that allowed the state to grow capable without constraint ultimately guarantees that its eventual, unavoidable confrontation with reality will be maximal, sudden, and potentially destabilizing to its very foundations.
Is a devastating conclusion.
Before we conclude this analysis, rigorous methodology requires us to address the counter-argument.
The author candidly concedes this point in the text, and we must examine it.
We must consider the alternative hypothesis. What if there is no fault whatsoever in the client state's learning apparatus?
What if the state is processing information perfectly, but they simply exist in a fundamentally hard environment where no stable, negotiated settlement is available at any tolerable price?
In this alternative reading, the open-ended military posture, the repeated rounds of conflict, and the shortening intervals are not symptoms of a broken feedback loop,
but rather a completely rational, necessary response to an intractable, inherently hostile neighborhood that refuses to be settled.
It is a vital concession. The author notes that a short recurrence interval between wars perfectly fits both readings.
It could mean the state cannot learn, or it could mean the environment simply refuses to be settled.
But how do we separate them analytically? To definitively prove that the state's learning is broken, we would need to establish a counterfactual.
We would have to prove, objectively, that a stable settlement was actually available in reality, and that the state willfully, blindly refused it.
But as the text brilliantly points out, that question is not a neutral fact awaiting discovery in an archive. That question is the very core of the political dispute itself.
No amount of additional data, no release of classified documents will ever objectively settle whether a peace deal in a complex multi-generational conflict was genuinely, materially viable at a specific moment in time.
However, the author provides a rigorous structural rebuttal that survives this concession. The essay narrows its claim, but it does not retire it.
The rebuttal is this. If a state is structurally exempted from ever paying the true terminal price of refusing a settlement, it becomes structurally impossible to ever know if the environment is truly hard, or if the difficulty is simply being childly structurally chosen.
When a state possesses the material capacity to hold the military option open indefinitely, and it never feels the existential international price of holding it open because the great power patron is absorbing that cost.
The so-called hard environment may actually be, in part, produced by the very exemption we are examining.
A difficulty that a state is never charged for is functionally indistinguishable from a difficulty the state prefers.
This is where we reach the profound underlying danger of what the author terms redistributed learning.
Protection, in this specific architectural framework, does not merely redistribute military power, weapon systems, or economic resources.
It fundamentally redistributes the very capacity to comprehend reality.
I want to emphasize the ultimate casualty of the selective shunt, the penalty that was absorbed by the great power patron, the vetoed resolution, the deferred sanction, the diplomatic cover.
That was not just a bill being paid on behalf of a friend. That penalty was information.
It was the vital, necessary signal that would have told the capable client state that its overarching strategy had critically erred.
When you remove that information, the state remains physically strong enough to initiate conflict. It retains all its kinetic capability.
But it loses the one vital cognitive faculty that makes overwhelming strength safe to wield: the ability to know when to stop.
The ability to know when to stop is the absolute essence of grand strategy.
Without that sensory feedback, capability simply becomes a mechanism for perpetual, unresolved expenditure of blood and treasure.
We have journeyed through a remarkable, deeply challenging intellectual architecture today.
We began by dismantling the flaws in traditional 20th century alliance theory, recognizing that the capable client requires an entirely new diagnostic paradigm.
We examined the silent, highly engineered mechanics of the selective shunt within the cost transmission network.
We applied this framework to verify the structural realities of the 2026 war, mapping the penalties to prove the theory.
We navigated the profound epistemological blind spots that obscure these dynamics from observation, utilizing the analogy of the dam and the spillway.
And finally, we confronted the tragic structural inevitability of the geopolitical rupture, the catastrophic return of withheld consequence.
A rigorous structural analysis of a profound hazard.
As we close, consider this. If the penalty for a specific strategy never reaches the decision maker, is that difficulty truly hard, or is it simply a choice we've been exempted from paying for?
That is the question that sits at the heart of our analysis. We leave you with that hypothesis to ponder.
Thank you for listening to this journal briefing. I'm host 1 and this is host 2. We look forward to your company in our next deep dive. Until then.